Hello, konnichiwa. Welcome back. My name's Deanna and this is the HaxtonKnits podcast. I am really glad you guys decided to come back and join me for episode 3. This is the Master Knitter episode. So we'll do some of the usual format. I'll talk about what's on my needles, finished objects, and then after that I'll go into more in depth all about the Master Knitter program. As always, I'm drinking beer. This is Orval, which is my favorite beer. And I'm gonna try to make a clone of this probably this week. I purchased myself, I wanna say Robo Brew, but I didn't get the Robo Brew brand. It's a brewing system that's like all contained in one and has good temperature control. So that should be coming in the mail, hopefully, eventually. Everything moves at the speed of slow out here, so we'll have maybe some updates and footage of the brewing process for next show. Let's go start at the beginning. So finished objects, I actually have one finished object. Okay. Dun, 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 dun. Very nice. So those of you who watched last week's episode will know that these, well, maybe you won't know. Last week, I was talking about the Knits in Translation knit-along that's being hosted over at the Knitting the Stash podcast. And I brought out this attempt at knitting a pattern from one of the Japanese knitting books that I purchased when I moved to Japan. And I didn't feel like I was meeting the spirit of the knit-along when I made these. I sort of looked at the chart and kind of figured it out and just winged it based on my knitting experience. But I really wanted to go back and like really try to dig in and understand the pattern and actually translate it and understand how it was constructed, you know, and do it right. So I did. I'm gonna take these off so you can get a closer look. This is just some scrap yarn, and these are the hand warmers that I made. The yarn I used are leftovers from previous patterns. So the gray and sparkly yarn, let's see if you can see it really well here. I think you can. Anyway, the gray sparkle yarn is from the Lemonade Shop, and it's their sparkle sock yarn in the color Fire Pit. And I had previously made a pair of socks with this yarn. These have been worn many, many times and are well loved, so hopefully you don't mind the way that looks. But this was actually really cute. This is the Vanilla is the New Black pattern, which has a very interesting heel if you've never done it. There's no picking up at all for the heel. It's all increases and decreases. It was a really fun, easy to make pattern. But this isn't my current FO. That's just, I'm showing you the yarn I use. And I apologize, I hear my neighbor's dog is out there screaming. I think they got a new puppy next door. Anyway, so that was the one yarn, and then the dark green yarn, which I have a little bit left over too. This one, I just love the color. It's a merino nylon cashmere blend from Driftwood Farms. It's called Spindrift Sock. And this yarn, actually, I was on a road trip. I was driving from Seattle to San Antonio. I think I was in Oregon when I stopped somewhere for lunch. And as I was trying to get to my lunch destination, I physically couldn't get there because there was a farmer's market set up. So I just parked my car and I decided I'd walk through the farmer's market and get something to eat there instead. And at that farmer's market was this yarn booth. And I'll throw in some pictures. I took a picture of the label because I didn't know if I would remember it. I didn't have a label because I got a discounted skein of yarn that had some knots in it. That's why I took a picture of the label. So I'll throw those in there. But anyway, this is the book that this mitten pattern came out of. It's the Let's Knit series. And so these are the light version and the dark version of these mittens. So I think I did a little more justice than my first attempt. You can tell me. All right. But this week I went on a little craft shop search adventure. So I put into my phone, you know, craft shop, several places came up, but of course they were all in Japanese and they didn't have websites. So I just plugged them in and went for a ride to see what I would find. The first one ended up being a stationery store, the second one a glass studio, and the third one was a place that I had heard of and had been meaning to visit but never went to, and it was called Rainbow House, and it was a fabric store and yarn shop. And I'll throw in some pictures. They also had beads and other cute things like that. I was kind of excited. The yarn there, none of it were brands that I was familiar with. I think it's 100% Japanese brands that maybe don't go to the US or I just have never run into. But both of the yarns that were called for in my mitten pattern were there. So I thought that was really exciting. I should have bought them, I didn't. I did make some purchases though. But what they did have was the entire Let's Knit series, and I bought another book. So this is the Let's Knit men's knitting. So my other one is Let's Knit Knit and Crochet Otona style right here. And then this one is the Let's Knit men's. And there were several things in here I liked. I may go back and actually get the yarns that they call for because they're available and that's kind of exciting. But let me show you. There were 3 sweaters that really jumped out at me. Like I need sweaters, you know, I need sweaters. So this one, let's see, is just gorgeous. It's a men's cardigan. It's got a little color work band at the bottom and it's got cables. I'm not sure how they knit the color work, if it's knit in the round or if it's steeked. I don't know if Japan does steeks. I should have looked this up before I started. Let's look it up now and then cut the video. Okay, so looking at the pattern for that sweater, it looks like you do the color work flat, which I think would be challenging, but it's not complicated, so I could do it. I could make through it, or I may just knit it flat and steek it anyway. The other one I really liked was this one. Kind of hard to explain why I like this sweater so much. It reminds me of the like long underwear or long johns, the tops that have that kind of waffle print that we used to wear when it was really, really cold out. That's what that reminds me of. So maybe I'm just feeling a little nostalgic when I see that pattern, but loved it a lot. And then the other one I really liked was this one. It reminds me of the Weekender sweater by Andrea Mowry. I made one in orange not too long ago, but this just kind of looks like a nice men's version. Yeah, I liked it a lot. It also looks like it's in a nice woolen spun yarn too. So maybe future plans now that I've gotten a better grip on how to knit Japanese patterns. I was kind of tickled. All of the yarn here is the James Dean and John Lennon brand? I don't know, line of yarn. So I thought that was interesting. All right, next. Drink. So that's actually it for my FOs. I thought I would have another one. So the striped tease socks that we were looking at, and the striped tease socks, hold on, I wrote this name down. If it weren't for this podcast, I never would have went to look up the name of the designer of this pattern. And now I'm really glad I did, because it says striped tease socks by General Hogbuffer. I never would have looked that name up. I looked at the pattern 20 times and never noticed it said General Hogbuffer on it. But I went and looked at all of his other patterns and was surprised to find that several of the socks that are in my favorites queue are his. And I just had no idea. So that's funny. This is sock number 1. The toes are not grafted shut yet. And I thought I would have sock number 2 for you. And I was happily knitting away on it on the couch this evening. And I got down to the toe and I noticed that something was amiss. And I'm gonna take this off the sock blocker to show it to you. Bonk. So I used the same yarn, the same needles, and I know it was the same needles, same number of stitches because I counted. And can you tell that this bottom one is about an inch more than the top one? I don't know why. If you look, you can see it peeking out from behind. So I've got these lined up and I don't know why or how, but this second sock is huge. It's big, it's baggy on me. And I don't know what I did and I don't know what I want to do about it. Part of me wants to just pull the whole thing out and frog it and put the yarn away and start again another day. I don't think I'm gonna frog both of these. I think I'll finish the one that's finished and then try to figure out what I did wrong here. The only thing I can think of is that the first one I knit, it was living in my car and I would just knit on it whenever I had a minute to stop. And then this one I brought home and was able to spend more extended time period, like sitting on the couch knitting, and that maybe I have just a really relaxed gauge. I've never had anything this drastic happen before though. So I don't know if it looked that drastic on camera, but if you saw these when I tried them on, this one is huge on my foot and the other one fits me really well. So, not finished objects, almost finished objects. I did think it was interesting. I didn't on purpose match up the color repeats on this yarn, but it sort of happened. Let me show you. Line these up. So, you still have the same green top, you have sort of the same color repeat, and then I really noticed it when I got to the sole of the foot, that both the soles hit this same green part at the same time. So I find that interesting, is that I accidentally made the colors line up. And I have quite a bit of yarn left over from this, like probably enough to make another pair of shorties with, or use it as a contrast yarn. So we shall see. This yarn, like I said last time, was an Opal yarn. I bought it here at one of the Japanese craft stores at the mall. Put those away, drink some beer. Are there like, is there a YouTube rule about drinking beer on camera? Am I allowed to do it? I feel like in the US there's rules you can't show people drinking, like actually taking the drink of alcohol on camera. Maybe that's old, maybe I'm making that up. We'll see. What am I wearing today? I am seeing everyone on Instagram wearing their sweaters and hats and winter gear, and I can't. So I've just been fooling myself by wearing my knitted hats with my tank tops. It is still pretty warm here in Okinawa. We've had a couple of chillier days, and I think if I had lived here for longer than I have, I probably would be cooler than I am, but coming from Alaska, I'm still very, very warm. But this hat, I love a lot. This is the Luminosity hat. It's Tanis Fiber Arts, both the pattern and the yarn. And I made it from one of her mini kits. So the whole thing was from one mini kit. And then I had enough left over to make another hat, but I had to substitute something for this main color. So I did, this was actually one of the mini skeins here. I didn't have enough to do the top. But if you're thinking about making this hat, just know that you could probably make 2 hats from it, especially if you use a separate yarn for this main color. And I'll put in some pictures of the 2 hats because they're dear to my heart. All right, whips. I'm not gonna show you the Nell sweater. I just didn't make any work on it. I do have a new cast on. Well, it's not a new cast on yet, it's a swatch. There we go. Very exciting, right? So this yarn did come from the Rainbow House that I went to visit. It is called Knitting Cotton, and the brand is Daruma. So Japanese label, I'm assuming a Japanese brand. And I got 2 colors as best I can tell from the labels. This is color number 12 and this is color number 2. And I got these to make a baby blanket with. This swatch is not so much a gauge swatch as it is a machine washability swatch. So I'm gonna throw this through the wash a few times and see how it holds up, because I'm giving it to a friend who is gonna be a first-time mom and is not in the fibery world, so probably is not accustomed to hand washing as many things as I am. And so I really wanted to make sure that it was something that would hold up well to washing. The second whip that I have on the needles, this one is of my own design. So this is a half finished object. I wanted to make a shawl. I talked about this in the first 2 episodes. This is the Blue Sky Woolstok yarn. The color is cast iron, and then the contrast colors came from a sampler set. I think it's a 21 color sampler set, and I wrote down the names of the colors. So the light blue is Spring Ice, and the dark blue is October Sky. The lighter green is Golden Meadow, and I didn't write down the darker green. But, okay, you guys are probably gonna think I'm nuts. I decided to knit this shawl in 2 pieces, and I'm gonna seam it up the center. So this is actually going to be the center line, and I will end up sewing it together. And I know this might just be my own craziness, but I don't mind sewing things up. I kind of enjoy it. What I do mind is managing lots of little color strands that get all tangled together. And so just for the sake of color management while I was knitting, I decided to go with half as many balls of yarn dangling off my knitting. This technique is done, it's similar to intarsia, but you don't have to do any twisting of the yarn as you go, because you are advancing up 1 stitch each row. Just by consistently picking up the stitch the same way, you'll end up with the yarn holding together really well. I think it looks kind of nice on the backside. And so I'm going to try to weave in the ends really, really carefully so that it might be a little bit reversible. And I liked my sample swatch. When I seamed up this seam, it made a really pretty ridge down the center of the wrong side, which I also thought was nice looking. So we'll see how that goes. I'm not convinced I like the shaping. I was trying to do a little bit of like a wing, because I always feel like those wings stay on really well. So half finished object. This would be the back. This would be the wing. So we'll see how that turns out. I may pull back maybe a few rows and reknit the edge of this, because I don't really like the way this wing turned out, but we'll see. Would you guys be interested in this as a pattern if I wrote it up? Just curious. We'll see. I did make a little mistake on this guy. I started picking up, and bear in mind I'm a left-handed knitter, so I knit probably the opposite direction across the row that you do. Which I don't know if you'll be able to tell that just from me holding this up here or not. But when I added this color here, I started knitting with the tail. And I tried after a few rows to just ladder down, fix it and ladder back up. And I did. The stitches are in there. I don't know if I stretch it out, you can see, but something to do with the tension is off, and you just, like, they disappeared into this part. So what I think I'm going to do is, as I weave in these ends, I'm just going to duplicate stitch those right over the top. So just kind of embroider the stitch in and hopefully hide that little bit of a mistake there. Gosh, I have lots of mistakes this week, I think. And I'm not typically one to pull out or frog or rip back. I try to ladder down and fix it, and if I can't, then I try to duplicate stitch or whatever. This one driving me a little bit nuts. I really probably should have just gone back and frogged it, but I think once I weave this in, you won't be able to tell. We'll see. So hopefully next week you'll have a better finished object picture on this. Oh my, I am tangled. Okay, yarn. All right. I have one more work in progress this week, and it's spinning. I'm excited. I don't spin. I wish I spun more. I think I talked about this before, is I like to spin, but then I never pick up the yarn to knit with. And so as a result, I start to get this backlog of hand spun yarn and I never know what to do with it. But I've been spinning anyway. So this is the fiber. It is an organic Polworth and silk. I bought this in Girdwood, Alaska at that Forest Fest I talked about previously. And this is all that I have left, so hopefully close to being done. You'll hear me crinkle here for a minute. So I've got about 2 skeins done already. And I think it's pretty. I'm not an incredibly experienced spinner, and I don't ever start spinning with this concept of like, I'm going to make this or I'm going to make that. I did that once. One time I decided I was gonna spin yarn for a sweater, and I bought the yarn and I spun it all up, and it ended up being the thickest, heaviest sweater I've ever made. It ended up being like, I was aiming for a 3-ply worsted weight, and I ended up with like I think like each individual ply was basically a worsted weight, and the sweater ended up being like 5 pounds when it was done. I'll put a picture of it up. It was my adaptation of the dude sweater from The Big Lebowski, and I made it as a cardigan. It was very, very, very functional in Alaska, and when I lived in North Dakota, it was very useful there. But anywhere else in the world, it would never ever get worn, and even in those parts of the world, it only got worn on very cold days when I was gonna have to be outside. So, yeah, that was the last thing I purposely spun for. So now I just kind of sit down at the wheel and spin and see what comes out of it. So, yeah. I actually have an idea for this one. Let me put it away. And each of these are about 40 grams right here. My idea for that yarn is the butterfly shawl, or what's it called? Papillon by Marin Melchior? I said that wrong. I'm gonna put a picture up. I just have been looking at this shawl for a really long time. I think it's really pretty. I have been thinking about maybe knitting it with some of my hand spun, but then part of me knows that I really like it in the original yarn and, you know, the picture, and I kind of want to just do exactly what the picture shows. So we'll see. Again, like I said, I never gravitate towards knitting with my own hand spun. But that is all for my finished objects. We'll talk a little bit about future plans. I feel like I ought to rename this segment Daydreaming, because future plans makes it sound like all of these are gonna happen, and they're definitely not gonna happen. I definitely didn't seam up that Zweig sweater that I talked about last episode, so we'll see. But future plans, on Instagram, I saw on the Jimmy Beans page, they're doing a crochet along of the rosette. I think is it the Rosetta? I don't know if it's a wrap or a shawl, but it was just beautiful. And I saw that they were selling kits for that. The yarn, okay, the pronunciation of this yarn is hard. I think it's like shipyas, I think. But in our house, we call it sheepies. Sheepies, like a small child saw some sheep and went, sheepies! Yeah, that is how we say it in my house, because I don't know how to pronounce it. And there are some things that you just have to accept. Like we will always say mooses instead of moose, even though we know that there's no such thing as plural mooses. In our house, it's always look at the mooses. So please don't correct me. Don't do it. I don't care. I'm gonna say it wrong. I just want you to know I'm saying it wrong on purpose because I'm having a hard time with the pronunciation. make a drinking game. Every time I stop to take a drink, you guys gotta stop and take a drink too, right? All right, so I think that's it. That's it for my current finished objects, my current works in progress. Let's move on to the Master Knitter program. So I mentioned that I graduated from the Master Knitter program in December, I think it was. So first of all, what is it? The Knitting Guild Association has a couple of correspondence courses that they offer. They offer the Master Hand Knitter program. And the reason they specify hand knitter is because they also do a machine knitter course. I don't know if they still offer the Master Machine Knitter course or if it has changed. They went through some changes while I was going through this program. So there were some changes in the Master Knitter program while I went through it. When I originally started it, I think this was 2012-ish. They were a for-profit company, were sending out a paper magazine, and it switched over to a non-for-profit company. And the Cast On magazine that they published became an e-magazine. So first of all, to participate in any of these programs, you have to be a member of the Knitting Guild. Membership gets you access to the Cast On magazine and archives of all of the past ones. Cast On is an educational knitters magazine, so they are kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of different types of techniques and history of knitting and knitting styles. It's a very useful tool to have, especially if you're working through the Master Knitter program, as well as they have a whole bunch of articles written by some of the master knitters on different techniques. So having access to that's very handy. They are also doing a couple of other programs that I don't think they were offering when I first started, including the professional knitter course. So my understanding is that course is similar in the knitting content as the Master Knitter program. So you're still knitting, still like doing the same sort of knitting techniques, but it doesn't have as much of the research and paper writing. So you won't be writing an article about the history of knitting or specific knitting techniques or anything like that. So go over to the website and check that out. I'll try to pop up a link and I'll for sure put a link below for you. They also offer certificates for knitting judges, certificate of technical editors, and then also basics courses. So they have like taming tension, basics. Really cool program. It is all correspondence course. So for the Master Knitter program specifically, what you will do is you're gonna purchase your membership and then your level. So level 1, 2, or 3 are each purchased separately. So you purchase your membership, you purchase your level, and you're gonna get instruction packet that you are gonna work through. It's gonna ask you to do a number of swatches displaying technical skills, and then you have a lot of technical questions to answer. There's a project for every level, so we'll talk about those. And then you have to independently research these. So you're gonna go find books. One of the requirements is that for everything you do, you have to have 2 references that agree with each other. And that's tricky, especially if you get into like, you know, just the general internet sources. So what I recommend is getting a like core group of books that you're gonna use for the program. There were about 3 that I always used, and then I would reach out to other ones if I couldn't find agreement between those 3 books, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. So I want to talk a little bit about each of the 3 levels. I have with me level 1 and level 3. And the reason is because when I did level 3, I took apart the level 2 book and used that same book to put my stuff in, and then never bought another one. So my level 2 is in a bag in pieces. But each level you're going to put together a binder. Whatever size binder they tell you you can use, they give you a range. Get the biggest one because you're gonna need all the space for it. Level 1, I think of as the basics. It's gauge swatches, ribbing, garter stitch, stockinette stitch, measuring gauge in all of those stitches, They're looking to make sure that you have really good tension, and you have a project. The project for level 1 is a mitten. You have to do their mitten. And I'm gonna show you, so this was the first mitten that I sent. And what you can see is they have tagged certain things as being problematic on it. And then once you have fixed those they send you this back with the feedback, and they'll tell you either, you know, we've showed you this so you can fix it, or we've showed you this just to make you aware and you don't need to fix it. It depends on what the thing is. So for example, if you have 10 swatches and 5 of them have the same mistake on them, they're gonna tag all of them, but maybe they're only gonna make you reknit one of the swatches. In this case, they did make me reknit the mitten, and so I've got mitten number 2 here. And what I actually wanna point out on here is, if you are a knitter who doesn't knit traditionally, so if you don't knit the way that people knit in the United States traditionally, you have to produce knitting that looks like you do knit that way. So this is what I mean. I said before, I am a left-handed knitter. I knit from left to right across the row as opposed to right to left. If I follow their directions, I actually produce a cuff that slants in the opposite direction of what it would look like if a right-handed knitter did it. So you can see this is the first one, the cuff slants this way. They pointed that out. They said, look, if a right-handed knitter knit this, it would slant the other way. So you need to produce one that slants this way, which means it's my responsibility as a left-handed knitter to adapt the pattern however I need to make it look as if a right-handed knitter did that. I don't know if you could hear, the noisiest car just went by. So what does that mean? For me, it means reading the written instructions backwards. So if it's, you know, knit 3 stitches, purl to the end of the row, I'm gonna have to purl until 3 stitches remain, knit to the end of the row. Whatever it is, that's what I have to do to make my pattern look like a right-handed knitter did it. For levels 1, 2, and 3, that wasn't, I'm sorry, for levels 1 and 2, that wasn't a huge problem. The big problem for me was, let me pull it out. This lace pattern, I don't know why, I wasn't thinking, and I did this little lace swatch, simple, and I thought nothing of it, and just didn't think at all that I needed to knit this way, because that's what the chart said. I was just following along and made my slant this way. Most of the time as a knitter, as a left-handed knitter, it doesn't matter. Most patterns are mirror images. So if you're making a cardigan and it says to knit left front, if I follow that instruction, I will actually produce the right front, but it won't really matter because the shaping's the same. A lot of times if it's charted, you know, I just read the chart the opposite direction from everyone else, no big deal. But written directions, you have to get a little careful about it. And then of course my decreases, like a knit 2 together is a left leaning decrease for me, whereas for right-handed knitters, it's a right leaning decrease. So that's just something to be aware of. They mention other people, like, so if you are a person who knits across the row and then instead of turning and coming back, you knit back the other direction. So you don't turn, you just continue on the right side. You just have to interpret the pattern so that it looks the way a traditional knitter would do. So, project for level 1, I'm gonna put this away. If you are doing the Master Knitter program, just note this dark color yarn will not be accepted. I think they let it slide for me because it was just the little contrast yarn, but they are super, super picky about which yarns you use. So the requirement is a smooth yarn that is still commercially available, so it can't be a discontinued yarn. And it has to be a light color. I think now they specify pastel or natural, and it cannot be heathered or marled at all. Gosh, I think my neighbor's dog is being killed. I shouldn't laugh, but he makes that noise all the time and it drives me insane, especially when I'm trying to be sleeping at night. Okay, so yarn, yes, so smooth, pastel or natural, no heathered. I had one swatch that I submitted and they rejected because it was a heathered yarn, and I had literally had every person at the yarn shop look at it. Everyone agreed it was a solid color yarn, it wasn't heathered, but just be careful, be very picky about the yarn you use. And it's for a good reason. They're trying to evaluate your knitting, and also, you know, as we get a little older, sometimes these dark colored yarns are hard to see, especially if you're sitting on your couch in poor lighting or something like that. So just, you know, do everyone a favor, light colored, natural colored, pastel colored, solid colored yarns only. They do give you a little bit of leeway with that when it comes to your level 3 projects. So I'll talk about those a little bit more, but you get to design some projects of your own on level 3, and that's where you get a little more freedom in your yarn choices. If you are wondering, this yarn is Cascade 220. Lots and lots and lots of people have used this yarn. I just got it because I knew it would be accepted. Actually, I'm glad I talked about that. I ended up switching to a different yarn for my other levels. So I used Cascade 220 because that's what everybody else used, and I knew it was accepted when I did level 1. I ended up switching over to Valley Yarns Northampton. And the reason I did that was because it was cheaper and I liked it better. I thought it was a little bit nicer quality and it held up better and it looked better when it blocked. That may just be personal choice, but that's the yarn I used for the most of level 2 and 3. Anyway, so level 1, technical work. So they have you do these gauge swatch worksheets for all of your swatches and all different types of stitch patterns, just to prove that you can do it right. They have a bunch of technical questions that you submit. So you can just see what my technical questions look like. I highly recommend doing your knitting and technical questions at the same time. So level 1, I was like, I want to knit. And I just knit straight through. I did all the swatches, and then I started trying to put together the swatch sheets. So every single swatch, you have to submit a sheet with your references, any notes they want you to give them on those swatches. And I found that because I didn't take good notes as I was knitting them, I couldn't remember the sources that I had used, and I ended up having to go back and do a lot of the research again just to get that information. So I highly recommend, if you find that you have just finished knitting a swatch, to just go through and double check, are there technical questions based on this swatch? Have you answered them yet? Have you put all the required information on the swatch information sheets? So that's level 1, let's move on to level 2. Don't laugh, guys, but my level 2 is in a bag. I think I said that already. Level 2 I call the finishing level. There's a lot of buttonholes, so like three different buttonholes per swatch, and you have a couple of swatches where you do them. Pockets, neck holes, neck shaping, cuffs, stuff like that, but also seaming. This I really thought was very helpful. So like seaming different stitch patterns together. So how to make a nice pretty seam in garter stitch, in seed stitch, in stockinette, etc., etc. I just want to show you. So for example, seaming together seed stitch. There's some fun stuff in here too. There's some lace. Yeah, let's see. So in this level, you start writing also. So you're gonna be writing your own patterns. You have to follow their template specifically, and you will have to do some charting. I use Stitch Fiddle, which is an online free charting service. I did end up, paying. They have a free service. I think you could get the job done with the free service, and then they have a premium service that gives you a little more options. I think that I did end up buying that premium service, but I don't know if it was because of the master knitter or because right about that time I started writing patterns for myself and I wanted those more options. Yeah, I just can't remember. But so for example, on this one, it's like design and write a pattern for a lace swatch. So here's my swatch. You do have to tag all of them. You probably don't have to put cute little stickers on them. You do have to put your name and address. I don't know why I'm covering up my address because I don't live at this address anymore, but that. Level 2 has a project also. I hated the level 2 project. Okay, so the level 2 project is an Argyle sock. I created one sock. And as soon as I mailed this out, I said, if they make me knit another sock, I'm gonna cry because I hated knitting Argyle socks. Partly because I hate intarsia. And so this is a sock that has intarsia and you knit it flat and seam it. They do ask you not to seam up the back so that they can evaluate your insides. That sounds wrong. They're not evaluating my insides, the insides of the sock. But yes, this is my Argyle sock. I think it turned out pretty well. I'm not happy with the way this black line right here at the heel meets up. And I pointed that out when I submitted it and they didn't say anything about it. Something about this program, don't try to like hide mistakes. So admit them, tell them what you did to get past it. And that's usually fine. On this particular sock, somehow this gray stitch here, I forgot the very first stitch, or was it the very last? I can't remember what direction I was knitting now. Anyway, so on the point, it was missing the stitch that made the point. And I told them, there's no way I'm pulling it back and re-knitting. I just, like I'm planning on doing with my shawl, duplicate stitched and sewed a little stitch on there. They said that's exactly the same thing they would have done, so no problem. They did point out some problems with the sock, but thankfully did not make me re-knit them. A lot of these are like twisted stitches, so I chose to do the diamonds in Argyle and then come back and duplicate stitch the lines on. I don't think you have to do it that way. You can do the lines in tarsia too if you're so inclined and love intarsia. I hate intarsia. I just hate the yarn management of intarsia. I love what you can produce with it. And I did bring with me the book. So this is the book that I got my intarsia sock pattern from. I just noticed there's a cute little baby version of them. But this is the Vogue Knitting Socks, Vogue Knitting on the Go series. All right, level 3, we'll get through this pretty quickly. Level 3, I call the fun level. This is where you get to do all of your, just different techniques, different things that you may not have done before. So this is where you get your brioche, your entrelac, smocking stitch, honeycomb stitch, etc., 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 double knitting. You are continuing to write patterns for yourself for some of these. This is my mosaic stitch. I really, really enjoyed this swatch. You do like doilies, lace doilies. So this is the only lace yarn that you use in your whole project. Now, I was super excited to get to level 3 because level 3 is where you get to design your own projects. There are 2 projects. You're gonna do a sweater and a hat. You get your choice. One of them will be an Arenda project and one of them will be a Fair Isle project. You have to do all the research and knit them in those traditions. So the projects for level 3, this is, oh, I didn't talk about the level 2. Level 2 didn't have just an Argyle sock. You also did a vest, and I will pop up, I did 2 vests because my first vest they said was not traditional enough of a vest. So this is where I mentioned before, just give them exactly what they're asking for. So if they say knit a traditional vest, find a very boring, very straightforward vest and just knit it. I ended up doing Arenda Holladay's vest pattern, and if you don't know, she is the head of the Knitting Guild right now, and she does write a lot of patterns. She has a very useful blog, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, so the first pattern, I think they said was too much like a t-shirt and not enough like her traditional vest. So I ended up just doing her vest pattern, and that one passed right away. Level 3, I was super excited to be able to design my own patterns because, you know, all of these levels you're knitting very structured, exactly what they want swatches, exactly what they want projects in the colors that they want. And so I was excited to get a little bit of freedom, and you do get a little bit of freedom in your colors, especially like the Fair Isle project. It's tricky to get nice yarns for Fair Isle projects that are not heathered in any way. In fact, I feel like it's traditional of that style to have slightly heathered yarns where the colors will blend together. And so they will kind of ease up the color restrictions on those. I remember going nuts trying to find a non-heathered color palette of Shetland Spindrift. And I've got a little picture of me with like, I had their color card up and I had all the samples out and I was just going nuts. And I finally wrote to my co-chair and she's like, oh yeah, no, you can use heathered yarns on these projects. My other piece of advice is to talk to your co-chair before you knit your projects, because I probably would have saved myself some trouble with that vest and with my hat project. So like I said, I was very excited to have some freedom to design my own projects. I had spent the last couple years daydreaming about the projects that I would design, and I knit my first hat and it was flat rejected. And I'm gonna show you that hat. So this was the first hat that I knit for the Fair Isle project. And I just love this hat. I love it a lot. It's the Jamieson Shetland Spindrift. It is lined. It happens to be lined with cashmere. They did ask that you don't close up this one either so that they can see the inside of your work, which I'll show you. Look at that, and see how you weave your ends in and all of that. It has a folded over picot brim, or picot edge. There you go. All right, let's do this. My hair's lovely today. I love this thing. So, you're probably saying, well, why did they reject this? They had good reasons. So, the reasons this was rejected was because, one, the picot edge is not traditional for Fair Isle knitting. This band is very traditional. It features the OXO pattern, which is used all the time. But these bands here are much closer to Norwegian style knitting. So that was the reason they rejected the pattern. Also, they did not like the dark color that I used on the top because it was hard to judge. So what did I do? I did what any sensible person would do who had just knit and written up a pattern for a hat. I put it up for sale on Ravelry. So if you would like to make this hat, you can. It's called the Resurrection Paths hat. I have just released an update on this hat from when I initially wrote it because I started working with a technical editor. Finally reached a point where it was feasible to afford to hire someone to help me look at these, and got some valuable feedback about the readability of the charts. But there you go. This hat actually has a really cool technique. So if you do colorwork knitting, you probably know that you can produce a jog. So where the round joins, let me see if I can find it on here. When you are knitting in the round, you are not knitting in a perfectly straight line. You're knitting in a spiral. And as a result, where the start of round is, you will see a little bit of a jog. this it? It's funny, it's so hard to find. Yes, so here it is right here. Let's see if you can see this. Can you see right here where this green stitch suddenly becomes a yellow stitch? Right there. So this is where the end of round jog is. On this pattern where it falls sort of between these little box motifs, I did nothing, I just knit straight. You can do a technique where you slip the first stitch of the second row of a new color. But what I didn't want was for that to show up in this section, because this section has no like break in between. And the way I did that was by slipping. So this is written up in my pattern, but basically when you read the chart, you'll do the first row just straight across. But every row after that, the start of round is going to change by 1 stitch. So you're gonna reach your stitch marker, remove it, slip a stitch, and then put it back on. And then you're gonna start reading, you're gonna start the next row. And there's a red line kind of stair-stepping up my chart, so you know where the start of the row is for each round. And the result is that you just can't see. You can't see where the jog is on this section. So that's kind of a cool technique. If you have more questions about that, I'll be glad to answer them. All right, so anyway, that is my hat. I ended up writing a new hat pattern. I went very traditional. I didn't bring the hat with me. I should have, but here's a picture of my submission. So it's a tam, and you can kind of see it. And so you will design the pattern. You'll write a little blurb about why it's traditional, what you did. You will create the pattern and the chart. So one of the feedbacks they gave me was that they wanted a color chart. I initially made it in black and white. And the reason I made it in black and white was that a lot of people will print their patterns to knit them. And I thought if you don't have a color printer, it would be nice if it was charted in black and white. But anyway, so that was my hat, and I would highly recommend if you are doing the Fair Isle hat, Alice Starmore has a book. I'm gonna look it up because I got my thing right in front of me. I think it is Alice Starmore's book of Fair Isle knitting, but it had a schematic for a traditional tam. It makes it very, very simple to create this pattern. You can just kind of follow that along and plug in whatever stitch pattern you want. So for the second project, I chose to do the sweater as an Aran sweater. And here's mine. Bobbles are mandatory, must put bobbles in. And when I heard that, I was distraught because I hate bobbles. I don't like them, I think they're ugly. That's just my opinion. I thought really hard about just putting the bobbles right on the end of the sleeve, and then after everything was done, I could just rip it out, get rid of the bobbles, and then put them back in. But eventually I accepted the bobbles were a thing, and I just went ahead and put bobbles into my sweater. There you go. This sweater is it's got a saddle, so what that means is that the cable that runs up the sleeve runs all the way up the shoulder. So you're going to knit the sleeve and then this little strap coming off the sleeve, which is gonna go all the way up to the neckline. So you'll end up sewing together the front of the sweater to this top of the sleeve. And that was very, very tricky because I was trying to seam together reverse stockinette to reverse stockinette, then seed stitch to reverse stockinette, and then stockinette to reverse stockinette here. And it goes from like a vertical to a horizontal, or horizontal to vertical. And so I used all of the skills from the level 2 seaming techniques there. They did say that they were disappointed that I didn't do more with my neck. I just chose simple ribbing, but I did carry the cable, the little cable here up into the neckline. I think at this point I was ready to just give them exactly what they wanted and then move on with my life. But I love this sweater. I liked how it turned out. It's not perfect. The sleeves are very long. I submitted it with the sleeves folded up, expecting that they were going to make me reknit the whole sleeves, and they didn't. So that was surprising. I keep thinking about maybe rewriting the pattern, making the sleeves a little bit wider and a little bit shorter. And then maybe grading this out for multiple sizes and putting it up as a pattern for sale. I don't know, maybe, we'll see. But I do love it. The yarn is Alice Starmore. I'm kind of a fan. Alice Starmore, one of her books was the first knitting book I ever purchased. I remember like sitting on the floor of the yarn shop, going through all of their bookshelves and finally picking out one of her color work books. I can't even remember which one now because I actually own several. But I feel like she's a real authority on Fair Isle style knitting. She grew up in Scotland in a traditional fishing village and speaks Gaelic, and I'm a big fan of all of her work. And I used her books heavily during this process. And I just thought, who else would you get yarn for if you're gonna do a traditional project? So yes, I used her yarn, which is, it's not a very soft yarn. It's rustic and toothy, but it's really perfect for this sort of outerwear sweater that's good for heavy winter days. This is gonna keep you warm for sure. And as you can see, this is a little bit of a darker yarn, which did not seem to be a problem for my level 3 project. So I wanna talk a little bit about some of the resources I used. Okay, whew, this episode's going long. We're gonna play a drinking game where you guys have to take a drink every time I take a drink. Except you don't know that I've cut out a lot of drinks and refills. Okay, so like I said before, for all of the Master Knitter program, you have to have at least 2 sources that agree with each other. I always start with the Knitting Guild website because they have tons of references there and articles with pictures, and very, very useful. And they write specifically for the Master Knitter program. So if it's a technique done in the Master Knitter program, chances are they have an article already written about it. If I didn't find it there, the next stop was Arenda Holladay's blog and YouTube channel, where she very helpfully shows videos of how to do all these things, or the Ravelry group. So I would go to those. Those were kind of my first stops for all the techniques. My second stops were my core books, which for me was Vogue Knitting. This is the Ultimate Knitting book. This is the old version of it. There is a newer one. I keep thinking about getting the newer one because it has things like shawl design, shaping, and construction, and just some things that I want now, not things that were necessarily needed for the Master Knitter program. I will say that almost all of this book is available online on the Vogue Knitting website, but it has nice pictures and is a good source for your technical questions and research. The other book I used was the Knitting Book by Frederica Patmore and Vicky Haffenden. It looks like this. And this one too has lots and lots of pictures. Neither of them are very wordy. They're just very, very helpful, quick reference tools for this program. The third book I used, I own a digital copy of, but I ended up renting it from the library. It's The Principles of Knitting by June Hyatt. If you have seen this book, I'll try to put a picture in. It looks like a college textbook. It's big. It's like this thick, hard-covered, huge. I saw an interview with June talking about the process of creating this book, and it sounds like it really was like a huge labor of love project. It's a huge book. If you cannot find a technique in this book, it probably doesn't exist. It's like every technique possible, but they aren't all named the way you would expect them to be. So for example, you will not find the long tail cast on referenced. It's in there, but it's not called that. I can't remember what she called it. Same thing with like increases. Like you won't find make one increase. It'll say lifted, twisted increase or something. It's kind of like she describes the increase, not like the name that we all know it by, but the text is super detailed. So if you're not sure exactly how, like you went to this book and it says, you know, just pick up from back to front. Her book is going to have a paragraph on how to do that. So it's very, very detailed, very, very useful. You can find a lot of techniques that maybe you don't find anywhere else, or like different versions of a technique that you've never seen done. I thought it was very helpful, but just know it's a little, you kind of have to dig into it a little bit, and it can be really expensive. I've seen them on Amazon for like a couple $100. I looked just recently and saw one for about $60, which is a little better than it was, but I found it at the library and I just checked it out all the time. I would highly recommend using your library. For level 1, I bought a lot of books, and then it just occurred to me one day, oh, I could go to the library. And the library had all of those books and so much more, plus the ability to request books. I don't know if every library is as good as the one in Alaska is as far as knitting books, but we had a huge knitting section. And so it was very, very helpful for me. Some other books that I used. So at some point you write a paper on the history of knitting. I think this book is mandatory for that. So Richard Rutt, A History of Hand Knitting. This book's interesting. Even if you're not doing the Master Knitter program and you just want to know more about the history of knitting, I think this book was really fascinating. I probably am going to read it again because the first time I read it, I was looking for very specific information for the purpose of my report. And now that I'm done, I just kind of want to read it and absorb it. I also used this one, which is Knitting in America, A Glorious Heritage from Warm Socks to High Art by Susan Strawn. And it looks like this. And I thought this book was really, really useful too. You don't have to do knitting in the United States. I think they ask you to do like a general knitting and then like comment on a specific area. And I'm from the US, so I did the United States. I can't remember if it's level 2 or level 3. I think it's level 2. Anyway, one of the levels you have to write a paper about 2 different knitting traditions and kind of comparing and contrasting them. I chose to do Andean knitting and Fair Isle knitting. I picked Fair Isle knitting because we have that project and it just made it easier. I already did some of the research for it. And then I picked the Andean knitting because it is another tradition of knitting that uses stranded color work, but it uses it in a different way. And so I thought that would be interesting to compare and contrast. And so I used this book for the Andean folk knits. And I love it. This was a good book. I'm just gonna stop and admire the book while I'm supposed to be podcasting. But what I liked about this book is that it's not just a pattern book. She talks a lot. She talks a lot about the history and what she sees, and you know, kind of talks about a trip she took. I'm just going to show you a picture of the inside of the book. Okay. Is that everything that I want to tell you about the Master Knitter program? Something I get asked a lot is why? Why did I choose to do the Master Knitter program? The reason I picked it, honestly, I was here in Okinawa when I started it. Probably, I don't remember. It took me 5 years to complete. I think it's designed to take you about 3 years or maybe 3 to 4. I went to nursing school in the middle of it, so I completed level 2 while doing nursing school and moving my family from Okinawa to Florida, and then Florida to Alaska, and then Alaska back to Okinawa. So it took me a little longer, but I started it while I was here in Okinawa because just kind of in a knitting funk. I didn't have my knitting group anymore. The weather wasn't really conducive to knitting. There weren't really many yarn shops. So that is honestly the only reason I started it. I was looking for a project. I initially thought that I probably wouldn't learn that much because I was a good knitter and I had tried a lot of techniques and I was an adventurous knitter. I was really wrong. I did learn a lot. In fact, several times throughout this process, I was like, I don't think I'm a good enough knitter to be a master knitter. So it was funny to see that like confidence swing, like, oh yeah, I'm a master knitter, to I'm never gonna pass. And then I passed and I couldn't believe it. And now to this day, like everything I show on this podcast, I think, oh, is this a good representation of what a master knitter is? And I don't know. There's still plenty of things that I do wrong in my knitting. I still have a hard time with my tension on the edges, on my selvages. I work on that. It's funny, some of the things you pick up. So through the whole Master Knitter program, you're not allowed to do any slip stitch edges at all because it hides that unevenness. And so like, it took me, you know, about a year after completing to finally start doing slip stitch edges again and not feel like I was cheating in some way, which it is. It's cheating. It's not cheating, it's fine. You know what, we're not quite done. Wait a second. So one more thing about left-handed knitting with the Knitting Guild, with the Master Knitter program. When I did levels 1 and 2, I had the same co-chair, so the person judging my packages for that. For level 3, you have to have 2 people look at it. And so I don't know if this is a difference between the judges or a difference between the requirements of the level, but for levels 1 and 2, they really just wanted to see that the overall pattern turned out the same. So for example, the lace I showed you was leaning the right direction, the eyelets, the cuff was leaning the right direction, just like the general gist of the swatch was right. For level 3, my new co-chair was very picky. And so things like the cast on edge needs to be leaning the right way. And let me show you. Okay, so when you do a long tail cast on, let's see how close I can get this. Can you see, let's see if I can zoom in here. Can you see that these little strands on this cast on edge are kind of leaning this way, each strand? Well, a right-hander doing this cast on, those strands would be leaning the other direction. And I really felt like, how the heck am I gonna do that? And what I had to do was, well, for one of the swatches, I just sucked it up and tried to figure out how to cast on like a right-handed person. And then I did the rest of the knitting backwards. So like if row 1 was a right side row, I would work it as a wrong side row and just have to convert all the instructions back and forth. That was the same thing that I had to do for the entrelac swatch. So typically when I am having problems with right and left-handed knitting, I will just read the row backwards. And for entrelac, you can't do that because you're building these triangles or rectangles, depending on which row you're on, as you go. So as a result, all of mine were leaning this way when they should have been leaning this way. And if I read them backwards, it just doesn't work because it's, you don't have enough stitches. You know, you start here and you increase up and then start and increase up. So for the entrelac, what I had to do was do the whole thing from the other side. So if it said row 1, do this, and it was a right side row, I would read it as if it were a wrong side row and do all of the increases from the wrong side. Does that make sense? That's really tricky. Let me see if I can find that entrelac swatch. Okay, here it is, the entrelac swatch. This swatch, first of all, I was certain was going to be rejected because I was having such a hard time making the stitches look even and nice. Even now holding it up, I don't think, like, these edges don't look very good to me. But surprisingly it passed. I don't know why it passed. But yes, so the first time I did this, all of my white squares that here are going this way were going that way. So again, you know, would initially start. So for me, I would start here and increase up to here. And what I had to do was just completely reverse the pattern and basically do all of it from the wrong side. I don't know if I'm making much sense there. I hope that makes sense. But like if, for example, it says knit 1, increase, knit 1 for row 1, I would instead purl 1, increase, purl 1. And that's the only way I could figure out to make my left-handed interlock swatch lean the right direction. That is all for the show today. Please, if you enjoyed it, like and subscribe below. Leave a comment below if you have any more questions about the Master Knitter program, or if you would like to see that 2-piece shawl written up as a pattern. Maybe I can write that up too. And if you have any questions for future episodes or questions about Okinawa, let me know. I'll be glad to answer them. Have a good night, guys.